All right, I'm going to talk to you today about a line from a classic movie, uh, The Incredibles. And there's a line in it that I think most parents, but especially dads, can identify with. Right? It's towards the beginning of this movie that there's just some major stress going on in the household, which is pretty much every family. And they're sitting at the table, and the mother asks the dad to intervene. And so the chaos continues, and it gets out of control. And finally, the dad does what every dad who's a natural human being wishes they had the ability to do. I wish I could do this. Just picks up the whole table with everybody on it and just yells out, "All right, I'm intervening," and we all wish that we could do that. Of course, that's not what the mother had in mind, and I want to move on from the movie. Great movie. Now I'm going to have to see it again, but and talk about. And you could probably guess where I'm going. And I want to give another little story here. As a friend of mine was asked to be. This is some time ago. Was asked to be the caretaker, kind of the groundskeeper and all that, for a church. And we were in the same church together, and we came to church, and a tree was cut down, and there was a big problem with the tree being cut down. And I mean, I didn't care personally, but it was a historic tree, not really, but it had been there on the property for a long time. And so some people had grown emotionally attached to this particular tree. Even people who had moved away came back and had a problem with the tree being cut down. Why did you cut down the tree? Well, it was dead. Well, and so, quarrels ensued about this wonderful tree, and which was cut down. It's not like it was going to be put back up. But he said, "Listen, I've you asked me to do a job. I've worked in a tree nursery, among other things. I started working, it was my first job. I was like 14 years old or 15 years old when I got a job in a tree nursery. I know when a tree's dead and it's going to fall down and kill somebody. So I cut it down. I don't need approval. If you give me a job, I don't need your approval to do the things the way that they should be done. If you don't want me to do the job, then don't give me the job." It's probably pretty obvious where I'm going with this, but how many of us have asked God to intervene? We sit there and pray, and we wring our hands over society and where it's going, and we wish God would step in and do something, and how awful this is. And I don't want to lead you to believe that I think God made the coronavirus. Maybe he did, but I don't want you to lead. I don't know what he's doing, but I do know that he's doing something, because God doesn't not do something. I certainly know that Satan's using it. I think it's pretty obvious that Satan's using it to try to do things, hurt the church when he can, hurt God when he can. So I think that God is probably doing something back, whatever it is. And whether he initiated this or whether he's using it, I think we have to understand that God is active in the world around us. So there is a verse we often refer to, and I want to bring it into context a little bit, because it's one of those verses that we misuse a lot, and that's Romans 8:28, which says that all things work together for good to those who are called according to his purpose, right? And we misuse that, I think, a lot of times to say that, or some people use it to say that everything happens for a reason, and I don't want to necessarily go that far, but I want to focus on something else in that verse. First of all, we do recognize that it does say that God uses whatever is happening for a good purpose. But there's something hidden in that verse, I think, that we don't immediately recognize when we put that on wonderful posters and bumper stickers and various things like that. One of the things we don't recognize when Paul says all things work together for good, there's a subtle hint to us that we have to be reminded that all things work together for good. In other words, certain situations don't necessarily look like they're going the right direction, and that God uses them for good. So when we look at the world around us and how awful things look, we have to remind ourselves that it's those situations that look like they're not going the right direction that God is using. All things work together for good. I recognize that you don't see the good in it, but do understand that the situations that are not looking good, God is using those for good. That's why the reminder is there. So this is a little bit of a shorter one today, but I want to ask you to think about this as we conclude. Do you believe in divine intervention? Do you like the way God is divinely intervening? And think about this. One real quick thought is, in insurance, you buy insurance for your property, and they include these riders in there. You can pay for them depending on where you live. They're called acts of God. And what are acts of God? They're tornadoes, and they're all these sorts of things. Acts of God. We always attribute to God things which are violent and negative. We don't look around us and go, green grass is an act of God, and flowers coming up, and babies being born, and all these wonderful things about life. Those aren't acts of God. Of course, for insurance, they don't care about that stuff. But acts of God, whenever you talk about an act of God, it's always this force of nature that's violent and destructive. And I don't necessarily think that those are acts of God in that sense, but that God uses them. We attribute to God, and we're more than ready to attribute negative things to God. But are we ready to attribute the positives that come from those things to God? And are we willing to wait for them?